Welcome back to C2C Journal. Today we're discussing a topic that has stirred political debates in Alberta, the recent comments by former Premier Jason Kenney regarding the potential consequences of a Democratic vote on Alberta's future. Joining us here today is Collin May, author of his latest essay, Jason Kenney and the End of All Things, or Maybe Just a Democratic Vote. In his piece, Collin examines Kenney's remarks and the broader implications for Alberta's political landscape, questioning the tension between democratic processes and political rhetoric. Collin, it's great to have you. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me. Great to
Of
be here.
course. So let's dive right into it. So, Collin, your essay, you begin by highlighting Jason Kenney's recent comments about a potential Democratic vote in Alberta. Can you summarize what he said and why that caught your attention?
Well, Kenny had said a few things. He's come out fairly strongly against separatism. He says he's a proud Canadian, which I believe. Um, but what he did was he talked about the separatist forces in Alberta as being virtually irrelevant, just a small group perennially aggrieved. But at the same time, he went into a very long list of things and institutions that could just fall apart. He used the word break and divide a lot. So he
Mhm.
talked about marriages breaking up, church organizations and community associations breaking up, partnerships, business partnerships dividing. So what struck me so much about what he said was this very strange disconnect between the relative insignificance as he sees it of these people, seeing them very much on the separatists on the fringe, but this potentially devastating effect if we have a vote on separation, even it seems if we get into a discussion about it.
Mhm.
And he went on, he mentioned that if you follow these people on social media, which is I find a bit odd since, if they're not very important, why follow them? But he mentioned that they often refer to how much they like Putin and Trump, and he even offered his own services as to a leadership position on behalf of keeping Alberta in Canada, which given his departure from the premiership and the relative hostility that a large chunk of the population, not the majority, I'm saying, but a significant chunk of the population has towards him, I don't know if that would be the best approach.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like he's really describing it as the end of the world for Alberta, and that may not be the case, as you talk about in your essay. So, you describe Kenny's position as a curious, maddening, and somewhat sad case. What led you to characterize his stance in this way?
Well, I'm not trying to go after him personally. I mean, he
Mhm.
can have his views, and he certainly contributed a lot to Canadian politics, so I don't want to diminish that.
Mhm.
But for me, what's maddening is, there is a difference here. Jason Kenney is not an original Albertan. He wasn't born here. He didn't grow up here, uh, whereas I did. I grew up in rural Alberta. And during his comments, he mentioned Gordon Kessler, of course, who was elected as an MLA in 1982 at the height of the National Energy Program. And at the time, I was 12 years old, but I remember all the talk around separation or how Alberta was being treated. I remember how Peter Lougheed's government then won an election later that year, a massive majority, 75 of 79 seats in the province, and how did it in a way by taking the thunder away from Gordon Kessler. Kessler lost his seat that he'd won in the by-election. But I find it maddening because, this is sort of where my first awareness of politics sort of came from, was being in Alberta, not being hostile to the rest of Canada, but seeing the difference. And I think it's maddening a bit and sad that, we're still there. This is still a viable topic. It's still of concern for a lot of people. And we haven't really dealt with the institutional arrangements that have triggered this for over 50 years. I mean,
Mhm.
Kenny mentions that this is a 50-year-old movement. And yeah, it is and we haven't fixed the problems that are contributing to it.
Mhm. Absolutely. In your essay, you also mentioned the traditional role of former political leaders. How does Kenny's current involvement in political discourse differ from this tradition, in your opinion?
Well, I'm one of I think the models for departing, especially an executive role and going off and not interfering with the past is somebody like George W. Bush, who, of course, has said virtually nothing about anything his successors have done, and has gone off and done charitable work, that sort of thing. Of course, Bush came to the end of a presidential term. He couldn't run again, so that was it. And there's no higher office for him to hold. My impression with Kenny is he didn't leave on the best terms. He didn't want to go although I'm not sure if his heart was in it that much after COVID.
Hmm.
But it does seem different. It seems different even from Harper, who hasn't really engaged much. He hasn't been that critical of his successor, Trudeau. Somewhat he steps in a little bit, but I guess, as I said, Kenny looking for a leadership role in this is a bit strange. It's like he seems to want to make a comeback into politics, which is fine if he does. But I don't think it's really helping, given especially the way he left the role of premier here.
Hmm. Yeah. You also argue that Kenny's comments could be seen as undermining democratic processes. Can you elaborate on how his rhetoric might impact public trust in democratic institutions?
Well, what we're talking about here is a referendum.
Hmm.
And of
Yeah.
course, Danielle Smith has made them easier.
Hmm.
And a referendum are strange things, especially in our current political climate, because they're often going against the establishment. The elite doesn't like them. Europe, of course, is an example of that. After the Maastricht Treaty was signed in the early 90s, there were referendums, will France join this or Ireland? There were lots of countries who had to vote on certain things. And the EU basically kept them voting until they got the result they wanted, and then you stop.
Hmm.
And I think, they're diminishing or taking away the legitimacy of these types of votes is problematic because they often go to the core of and the foundations of our political arrangements. That's often what a referendum is about. So dismissing them or dissing, demonizing, even if you will,
Hmm.
other people who hold those views, especially, associating with Putin, who Kenny is because of his, I mean, legitimate support for Ukraine,
Hmm.
has certainly attacked Putin quite a bit and
Hmm.
continues to on his social media. So I think, making those associations, and we're seeing that again, people constantly referring, especially Trump, like is like Hitler, making these
Hmm.
absurd associations. They
Yeah.
don't help. They don't contribute to resolving what is, as I've said, an issue that I'm has been in my radar since I was a little kid,
Hmm.
and it's still going. And I'm, in my 50s now. So I
Hmm.
think, yeah, it's not helpful, I don't think.
Yeah. Well, in your opinion, like in terms of the potential consequences for the political climate in Alberta, with this kind of language becoming more prevalent, what do you like? Where do you see it going in terms of some of the consequences in the overall political climate in Alberta?
Well, I think, it certainly alienates a group of people. As I said, I grew up in rural southern Alberta,
Mm-hmm.
and I think there is more of a sense of alienation in the rural parts of the province, um, and more than you would see, I think, in Edmonton,
Mm-hmm.
which tends a bit more to the left. Calgary, where you have the oil industry, which isn't that comfortable necessarily with separation, although, I mean, if separation led to joining the US, given that so many of our oil headquarters are offices, with Imperial Oils leaving Calgary now, moving to the US or just
Mm-hmm.
taking people down there, maybe they maybe they'd be okay with it. I don't know. But I think, we don't want to continue this process of alienation
Mm-hmm.
and demonizing people for bringing forward concerns, legitimate concerns often, and it causes, I think, people to back away. They look for a way out. They don't, the normal processes of elections become more fraught
Mm-hmm.
and people begin to turn away from your regular procedures
Mm-hmm.
to a referendum, which, as I said, is a more usually a more fundamental type of vote than
Hmm.
just an election. So I
Yeah.
think it puts our unity in effect
Mhm.
in threat. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, and it ultimately sounds like it just prevents progress from being moved forward, right? We're not really getting anywhere with this kind of language and solving the problems, as you said, that have
Mhm.
been around for a couple decades now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
You also touch on the topic of political legitimacy in your essay. How do you think Kenny's statements challenge or reinforce the legitimacy of democratic decisions?
Well, I think, one of the problems that we're having, and I think this is not just in Alberta, it's in Canada, it's in the West generally, is behind this alienation, there are concerns about our institutions.
Hmm.
And as I mentioned in the piece, in the US, and this is historical accident in a certain respect, but also sort of because of how the US was founded as opposed to Canada. The
Hmm.
US does at least have, two senators from every state. It
Hmm.
also has a number of large population centers across the country. So, California on the West Coast is by far the most populous state, followed by Texas, Florida. Of course, it used to be they were all up in the northeast,
Hmm.
then to the Midwest. But, you know, in the US, you have just what's developed is a sort of more balanced type of political regime. And what I mentioned in Canada is we still have something of a more colonial system.
Hmm.
And I don't mean colonial as Britain, but kind of Canada itself. Alberta and Saskatchewan, the West certainly being somewhat like a colony to central Canada. And we haven't come up with structures that address that. And, even you look at the Senate, Trudeau changed the Senate so that it's supposed to be effectively less partisan. But unfortunately, what's happened is it's become much more woke. So I think it's become more ideological. It may not be as partisan, but it's much more ideological. And you have people from Alberta who I would say, for the most part, their views don't accord with those of most Albertans.
Hmm.
So it's actually maybe exacerbated the problem.
Hmm.
We have senators who simply are not in step with, I think, the majority of Albertans. Uh,
Hmm.
and so, we're all sort of so we're seeing Canada kind of dissolve. And of course, Justin Trudeau comes along at the beginning of his time in office and says, we're a post-national nation. We don't have an identity. So in a sense, as I mentioned it in the piece, we're kind of all becoming separatists now because we're just separating. Canada's kind of just dissolving, regardless of whether Alberta votes to separate. Of course, Quebec is likely to elect a PQ government next year, which Will has said they want to have a vote on separation. But we're kind of just de facto dissolving because our leaders are not providing us with a sort of cohesive, coherent notion of what Canada is. And we're not even debating it. We're not even allowed to debate it. A friend of mine said he remembered back when, Joe Clark and Pierre Trudeau were debating what multiculturalism should mean and all those sorts of things. We
Hmm.
don't debate that now because to do that is you're deemed outside the realm of the acceptable anymore. So debates that were had at one point, and of course, some debates you resolve, some come back. And as I said, this one seems to keep coming back. So I think, we are all becoming the legitimacy of the country beyond just whether we're going to have a vote on separation.
Hmm.
The country is dissolving in many respects. And it will just sort of in that situation, and that's not, as I say, that's not just Alberta or Canada. We see that a lot in Europe as well. There's issues about national identity there, and what does even the European Union stand for? So I think yeah, the legitimacy issue. We need to do things, I think, to reconnect the words we're using to the political reality. We need to be able to have discussions that are not banned or canceled
Hmm.
because somebody thinks they deems them to be unacceptable according to a certain policy or an ideology. And of course, many of the policies that we have in Canada that will get you in trouble if you challenge them only date back to the 70s, the 60s and 70s, and yet we're not allowed to talk about them. And I think Kenny certainly does talk about a lot of these things, but I think the rhetoric he used this time just contributes to that delegitimizing of reasonable speech.
Yeah. Well, to build on that a little bit, what steps do you think we should take to ensure that political discourse in Alberta remains respectful and upholds our democratic values?
Well, that's a tough one, I think, because I think we are, as I said, this is not just an Alberta or Canada thing. Much of the West is in a situation now where we're undermining almost daily our democratic procedures. And of course, I've discussed this in other articles. I've argued that we don't have one notion of democracy anymore. We have a group, sort of liberals, the left, maybe you might call them, who are developing a sense of what I've called prosecutorial democracy,
Mhm.
whereby democracy is not seen as voting and participation and bringing more people into the voting or the political process, as it has been pretty much since the American French Revolutions, even through the idea of social programs to bring more people into kind of so to build social cohesion. What we are seem to be doing is we're building a type of democracy that doesn't like participation, eschews it. It's these people shouldn't be involved. They're they're the dregs of society. We don't want them. Instead, we want people using disciplinary processes, whether it's through, the human rights commissions or tribunals or uh, experts telling us what should be democracy. And their goal is to somehow make the world more just, more equitable. Of course, fits into this. So, as long as we have that view, and it has a significant following, and even if that following is perhaps somewhat collapsing,
Mhm.
certainly somebody like Donald Trump takes it on in a very brusque way. And I
Mhm.
mean, even Putin, Putin certainly, his intellectual interests, the people who inspire him are not in that vein of prosecutorial democracy. So the question seems to be, how do we get over this? And I think we have to stop treating each other um, as somehow enemies to democracy, because we hear that all the time. We heard that, for instance, an example is Kamala Harris, and not to beat up on her or anything, but when she became the candidate, a lot of her rhetoric was, we have to protect democracy from Donald Trump. And yet, she was the first candidate for a major political party in the United States for president who did not go through the primary process since that process was first used. So, how are you defending democracy if you are just ignoring the procedures we've built up?
Mhm.
And I think that's the big problem. We've become hostile to these procedures.
Mhm.
We delegitimize them.
Mhm.
Now, certainly, Kenny has talked about the importance of our institutions, but if those institutions themselves sort of take on this prosecutorial democratic approach, where equity is more important than participation, um, the institutions themselves will start to push against um, the legitimacy of participation and voting. So I think we have to just reinforce these ideas that participating, voting, and if it's a referendum, you
Mhm.
know, is a legitimate thing.
Mhm.
Don't talk it down so much.
Mhm.
Bring people more in, get them more involved. Now, of
Mhm.
course, that muddies the waters, and I know a lot of bureaucrats kind of roll their eyes or get nervous when you have the masses getting involved in politics, but that is how we ultimately make these decisions. So, I think this is an example. We need to reinforce those things,
Mhm.
not undermine them. And, has Daniel Smith done that? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, there's some things she's done I've liked, some things not. But I think we have to get beyond a rhetoric that just demonizes the whole chunks of the population and because you're ultimately going to be demonizing their voice and their participation
Mhm.
in politics.
Absolutely. Well said. And finally, what is your main takeaway from your essay and from our discussion today about the relationship between political rhetoric and democratic processes in Alberta?
Well, again, I think it's as I said, we're kind of all separatists now.
Mm-hmm.
We've entered into this period where we don't want to define in any respect, and most nations define themselves in various ways. They look at their history, they look at their political institutions, and some of it is flexible, some of it is more. This is who we are, and that shouldn't be tampered with. Although time just changes everything.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the big problem, and my takeaway from this is that we really are having a lot of trouble getting our words to match up with reality. And that was what I found, as I said at the beginning, so striking about Kenny's words was, he was just this phenomenon, or even the idea of a vote. And, right now the polls seem to suggest that if you want to say remain or leave, using the Brexit terminology, the
Mm-hmm.
Remainers would probably win. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, you never know. Campaigns change things. Everybody thought the UK would never leave the EU, and it has. But I think, we have to get our words to match up and to present a potential, because otherwise we're losing large chunks of our population because they don't see any of the rhetoric that politicians use as serving their as relating to their reality, and as offering them something, a program that relates to them. Certainly, I think the NDP federally are going to have this debate because they've gotten so far away from their traditional working class base into sort of a woke dreamland that, it's wiped them out virtually. They're pretty much gone,
Mm-hmm.
and who knows if they'll ever come back as a viable political party.
Mm-hmm.
And, just to see what we've seen today. And as I said, this is, I think, a Western phenomenon. You look at what's happened in Manchester in the UK today
Mm-hmm.
with the attack on the synagogue,
Mm-hmm.
the killing of two people at least there, or four, I think, were in hospital. The latest news was, and everybody sort of gives this rhetoric. Oh, well, there's no place for hate and you fill in the blank, and it's your jurisdiction. The UK, Alberta, Canada, everybody says this. There's no place for hate.
Mm-hmm.
Or, where everybody's in our thoughts and prayers. People who have never probably prayed in their life don't even know have any sense of what prayer really is, are saying these things. And yet these things keep happening. There's no means. Our rhetoric doesn't address anything. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't lead any of our actions. And, especially for, I think, people who are your average citizen, um, you know, they're not looking for you to solve all their problems, but they are looking for politicians to provide some sort of program, some sort of options that they're to put out there to say, we are going to deal with this problem you're having.
Mm-hmm.
And they're political problems. As I say, most people will deal with their own problems. They don't want government interfering in too many. But government does have certain responsibilities to deal with the big picture things. And yet we seem to be in a place where no political ideology is really able to do that. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, Kenny's known as a conservative. I mean, he's very supportive of our institutions. And I remember when King Charles was here, he was all excited, and King in Parliament phrase, which almost no Canadian who knows what that means anymore. But the thing is, if these institutions can't reflect our what needs are the needs on the ground of many of our people and many of the voters, they will go to other things. They will look for somebody who offers them a very almost overly intense and sometimes very authoritarian connection. They'll read to reconnect their problems to the proposals politicians are making. And of course, Donald Trump has done that in many ways. He has some authoritarian elements. I don't think he's a massive threat to democracy that his enemies have made him out to be, or even Kenny is making him out to be.
Mm-hmm.
He's not Hitler. He's not Putin. And I think he's not Putin because there's just such different systems between the United States and Russia that he can't be Putin. You do have, if for somebody who respects institutions so much, I think Kenny has to remember that the institutions of the United States make it very difficult to do what Putin has done in Russia. It's just very hard to do there. But I think, that's what we have to look at. We got to get our these people back, and demonizing them. And it sort of sounded, I don't think Kenny and Hillary Clinton are that compatible politically. But, when she referred back in her campaign in 2016 to the deplorables, um, and those deplorables are getting tired of being called deplorable. They're saying we got problems, we got issues. And as I say, going back to my own youth and to the fact that I've been an Albertan. I was born here. I was born in Claresholm in southern Alberta. Lived on a farm there, grew up there, went to University of Alberta, left the country for 10 years to do some other stuff, came back. Um, I'm a lawyer here, and I've been involved in, I'm the Human Rights Commission, the College of Physicians and Surgeons, the Judicial Advisory Committee, the federal one for Alberta. But I keep seeing this coming back. As I said, I was 12 years old when Gordon Kessler was elected, and I still see these issues, these concerns. And just because the majority of Albertans may not vote for separation, it doesn't mean they don't feel those concerns. They don't sense that their role or their place in the country is not they don't feel that it's a fair role. And of course, beyond that, as I've said, when we've got a prime minister saying, well, we don't have any identity, we're just sort of this agglomeration of individuals bumping into each other, you know uh where do you go with that?
Right.
It's pretty hard to have any sort of healthy politics in that situation. So, if Kenny wants to take a leadership role, which, as I said, given the way he departed, I doubt that would help
Yeah.
the Remain side. But I think we've got to we've got to stop demonizing people and make using this rhetoric. And normally Kenny isn't that off base, as I would say, in his rhetoric, but this seemed to be so strange, so intense. I never saw any people getting divorced in 1982 because of this.
Yeah.
I knew a lot of people who supported separation at the time. They were angry about the NEP. They were not, but they weren't, businesses weren't falling apart. Churches weren't blowing up over, so I think let's get back to just a calm, friendly, decent type of politics. Certainly there's strong disagreements. People will, yell at each other a bit once in a while,
Mhm.
but I think we need to get away from some of that notion of everybody who doesn't agree with me is a deplorable. It needs to be equated to, a tyrant.
Mhm.
And yeah, so I think hopefully we can get away from it.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Colin, for sharing your insights on this very important topic. To dive into the topic deeper, we highly encourage you to read Colin's full essay, Jason Kenney and the End of All Things, or maybe just a Democratic Vote, linked down in the description below. Colin, thank you so much again for joining us. It was great to have you, and thank you to everybody for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.